Hello, friends. Welcome. Um, Hello from Italy. I am actually right now at my parents' home in Rome, and I'm happy to have the opportunity today to talk about the Therīgathā, the translation that I did last year, together with the help of Bante Sudaso. So since I'm traveling, I don't have the Therīgathā with me, but the Therīgathā is this little cute zine featuring some of the translations that I made, and that you're always welcome to send an email to info@emptycloud.org to receive a copy. So today we're going to talk about the theme of love and attachment throughout the Therīgathā. But before we start, we can pay homage to our original teacher, Shakyamuni Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddham dhammam sangham namasami. So I wanted to start today's sharing with by reading actually one of the poems from the Therīgathā, and in particular the verses of the Elder Vada's mother. So Vada was a bhikkhu, and his mother was also actually a bhikkhuni. And here she gives Vada a teaching, and I think it's actually a very beautiful poem that also, pretty much exemplifies love without attachment. So the poem begins with the verses of Vada's mother, who says, Vada, do not get caught in the endless thicket of the world. O little child, do not take part in suffering again and again. Vada, the sages dwell easily, carefree and free from doubt. They have become cool and tamed, and abide free from influences. The path walked by the seers who have attained vision, leading to the end of suffering. Vada, devote yourself to that. And Vada replies, Mother, you speak from a place of self-confidence. I suspect, Mom, there is no thicket to be found in you. And she replies, Vada, not even the slightest thicket based on any conditions, whether inferior, superior, or in the middle, can be found in me. I have destroyed all influences by meditating with heedfulness. I obtained the three knowledges and completed the teachings of the Buddha. And Vada replies, Surely my mother spurred me with a noble goad with these compassionate verses of the highest benefit. After I heard her words, instructed by my mother, I was met with a sense of urgency to practice the Dhamma for the attainment of safety from bondage. With the mind bent upon striving, active by day and by night, being exhorted by my mother, I touched the highest peace. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Yeah, such beautiful verses. And so inspiring, actually, to have the verses of an enlightened mother. So an example, basically, of what it is to be a perfect parent, a really fully compassionate parent that only wants the best for their child, as many parents do, luckily, but also knows what the best is actually for their child, as many parents do not know. Right? When we can reflect on our own parents who most likely, were unenlightened or are unenlightened, we can see that some of the things, that some of the instructions that they gave us were very wholesome, and some others were a little bit less, wholesome. but wholesome in a kind of Buddhist perspective. So wholesome in the sense that, in the sense of beneficial, in the sense of reducing suffering, leading us towards awakening. And so we see that, for example, Vada's mother does not tell her son to go and get a wife and get a job, or have children and so forth, but rather actually encourages him to do the opposite, and warns him to not get caught in this endless thicket of the world. So what is actually the thicket? So here it's the word vanato in Pali, and vana is actually forest, and the Pali word of vanato is basically the forest, so the woods, but also the undergrowth, so to speak, a thicket. And it's kind of interesting because at Empty Cloud, at a certain point, we were having some Japanese knotweed that was growing in a little patch. And luckily we saw it, we found it immediately before it actually set root. It's an invasive species. It comes from Japan, and it's actually all over New Jersey. And it was brought actually to the monastery when we had to do a little bit of an operation before we got the monastery. So it was actually through some dirt that was brought from outside, and it has these kind of fragments, the root of Japanese. If you have any like fragments of the plant of Japanese knotweed, it propagates really easily, and it's a very resilient plant that will grow pretty much anywhere, whether there's sun or there is rain, or where there is, whether it's cloudy, shady, like whatever conditions, good soil, bad soil. So it's a very resilient plant, but actually it's very difficult to eradicate it once it has set roots. And when you actually uncover it, even though we had this plant for just a couple of months, it actually had already created a thicket underneath it. But literally, one plant alone can go for actually miles, can have all these like roots, the rhizomes that spread in all sorts of both horizontally and vertically. So it's actually very, very difficult. But the reason why I'm talking so much about Japanese knotweed is because it kind of gives us a practical kind of experiential sense of that thicket, endless thicket of the world that Vada's mother is talking about. And so in this thicket, we can get very, very much entangled. It's essentially the experience of samsara that we have. And all of these things in samsara that attract us, that make us lose time, that confuse us, and that also, comprises, let's say, all of our different emotions, where then we can become very confused and start mixing up love, so something really wonderful that we can experience towards our children, our family members, ideally towards every single sentient being. But we can mix it up with craving, with attachment, with selfishness, for things that are more related to our ego rather than to the welfare, for the welfare or the benefit of others, or without the understanding of how things are. And that is due to the vipallasa, so the distortion essentially that we have of reality. And so the distortion is that we tend to understand that things that are impermanent, we actually see them, even though we perhaps sort of conceptually understand that they are impermanent, our experience of them is to be permanent until they are not, and that creates dukkha. Because also the things that we think that are pleasant in reality are actually a source of suffering. So that is the second distortion of perception. And the third distortion of perception that we have is to think that everything is personal when in fact is impersonal. And then sometimes there's also a fourth one that is included in this list, which is actually to find, um, things, the things that we perceive as pretty in reality are actually ugly. And because we get caught in these distortions of views and these distortions of understanding the world, then we suffer. We can't get rid of our suffering. We can't get out of samsara. And we get caught, as Bhatta's mother says, in this thicket of the world. And so when we look at the Therīgathā and how essentially this sort of experience is described in a worldly sense, we see one of my favorite poems is the poem of Mutta. All the poems in the Therīgathā essentially are poems of awakening, of declarations of awakening of the Bhikkhunis. And so they come from an enlightened perspective, but they also touch on a side of when they were not fully awakened. And so Mutta, for example, was, she declares, and I'll read her verses, and she says, in her declaration of freedom, she says, I am well released and fully free, freed from the three deceits of the mortar, the pestle, and the deceitful husband. I am free from birth and death. I have uprooted that which leads to any state of existence. And so the three deceits of the mortar, the pestle, and the deceitful husband, we can talk about them either, literally, or we can actually talk about them in a sort of more metaphorical sense. And so, of course, the literal way, it's describing the experience of Mutta as a housewife and of her relationship with her husband, who apparently was not exactly following all the Buddhist precepts, but was actually cheating, probably it seems, on her. So being quite deceitful. But then the mortar and the pestle, so essentially also elements that were ordinary within the life of someone who was taking care of her husband in the home, perhaps also of the children, etc. So essentially the experience that Mutta was having in those particular circumstances, in that particular relationship. But if we remove the sort of literal sense, and we can actually see kind of more the metaphor is, this can apply to everyone, each one of us, when we think about the relationships that we want to, that we see ourselves in. Everybody is somewhat on the spectrum of romantic, at least to a point, in a point of their life. And that's usually, the sharing a kind of relationship with someone, whether it's, the same gender or the opposite gender, or non-binary gender, whatever it is, it doesn't matter. Whether one is in an actual marriage or just a partnership. But there is kind of that tendency, that aspiration of having, of creating that union and being together with someone, and idealizing a lot what that sort of living together, what that kind of relationship is, until the sort of honeymoon is over, as they say, right? Or there's in Italy, we say the crisis of the seventh year. I'm not quite sure if in America or other places in the world that's also said. But yeah, usually after 7 years outside of my country, there's like a bit of a crisis. And then we start seeing, kind of how all of these things, what we had imagined for a relationship to be like, we start seeing, a little bit, oh, this is deceitful. So what Mutta is talking about here is not only that she has experienced disillusionment essentially with her relationship, but actually she has thoroughly understood disillusionment, which means not going like we normally do, when we have perhaps a less than perfect relationship, then we end it and start a new one, end it, and then start a new one, end it, and start a new one, which is basically a cycle of birth and death of relationships. We do it in one life, but we've basically done it without discoverable beginning. So that is not the point. The point is actually either, if we're householders, to try our best within that relationship. In the Pali Canon, we see actually how the Buddha encourages us to. He describes it as to kind of, and also for monastics, actually. I think that the sutta that I'm about to quote is actually referred to monastics, and he uses the metaphor of like basically always acting with others as a newlywed wife who will come in, enter the house and be very careful with what she says and what she does, and how she goes around the home, and is very respectful and kind and sweet. But then after a while, he says, then she becomes accustomed to everyone, and then the speech becomes harsh, and then things aren't as lovely as they used to be at the very beginning. And so that metaphor is essentially used in order to remind us, and it doesn't matter, once again, whether we are female or male, or whether we're newlywed or not wed at all. But rather, whenever we meet someone that we really like, for example, how are we? How do we present ourselves? How do we relate to them? And usually we are at our best self, and we are very careful and very thoughtful. And we would want to actually create those conditions to be to improve rather than decrease, but at least in the sort of the worst case scenario, to stay the same. So to be always careful and present. So if we're in a relationship, to constantly cultivate those things as lay people, or if we're monastics, which is the case of Buddha, we're a different level of renunciation, a different level of our practice, understanding the emptiness, the sort of the not emptiness, well, in the actual Buddhist sense, but rather the emptiness of like the inherent qualities. The fact that these relationships cannot be satisfying in and of themselves. And so this is how she says that she's free from birth and death, and she has uprooted that which leads to any state of existence, which is essentially craving. Going from one relationship to another is, once again, a form of craving, which is the cause of suffering, the Buddha tells us. And so, as we were saying, understanding the element of dissatisfaction, and also the element of how impersonal all of this is. We tend to think when we're loving someone, when we're in a romantic relationship with someone, if everything goes wrong, for example, we just really take it very personal that person is doing something to us. Or if we're not in love anymore, if the honeymoon is over, as we were saying, so to speak, that there is something really wrong and mistaken with that person, or perhaps we can even like project it to ourselves. Go, oh, there's something really, really wrong with me, and well, there might be there's like a severe breaking of the precepts, then obviously that is something that we can adjust. But when it comes to relationships in general, we have to also understand that certain things are just part of living together. It's very difficult to live together. Even when we are monastics, we remove sex from the table, but we still actually live with other monastics. We still live occasionally with lay people, when they live in monasteries, when they come to monasteries for periods of time, then we are essentially living with lay people as well. They're lay residents that support the Sangha there. So we're constantly in relationships. They're platonic relationships, but we're constantly being in this sort of exchange where there can be a lot of greed, hatred, and delusion, all of the defilements that can come up and boil up, and we can take it really personally. But a factor of wisdom is understanding that none of this is personal. All of this is dependently arisen. All of this is just essentially how things work, And when we understand, we start distinguishing, what is the fertile soil, the good stuff, the good fruits, from the bad soil or the bad seeds, the bad fruits. Then we can start, kind of cultivating the good, and removing the bad, and then eventually uprooting the entire sort of thicket, so to speak. But first, we want to clear up the thicket and understand how essentially relationships come into being, and how our mind also gets entangled with all these things. There's a beautiful, actually, there's many beautiful poems throughout the Therīgathā, but actually, I really love also one of the beginnings, actually, of the poems from Upalavanna, that she describes how she describes essentially the drawbacks of sensual pleasures within her personal experience of before she became a bhikkhuni. And so she starts her poem by saying, "We were mother and daughter, but we also shared the same husband. This terrifying and horrible situation gave me a sense of urgency. Damned impure sensual pleasures, foul smelling and painful, where mother and daughter share the same husband. After seeing the drawbacks of sensual pleasures, I saw the safety of renunciation. I went forth in Rajaga from the home life into homelessness." So what I really love about this sharing from Upalavanna is, well, first of all, how she realizes, she talks about her story. So back in the time of the Buddha, polygamy was very common. So in this case, she was married to someone who probably had numerous wives, aside from her and also her mother. But exactly one of the wives was not a stranger, but rather was her own mother. And so she talks about it, not in the way like, oh, terrible man, terrible husband who is doing all of this to me, oh, awful, or like, look at my mom, she's being so horrible and mean to me, or whatever it is. But she actually understands with wisdom the source of it all. And so she says, "Damn impure sensual pleasures, foul smelling and painful, where mother and daughter share the same husband." So what does it exactly mean? This means essentially that when we get blinded with sensual pleasures, in Italian we have, so many sayings that are related to this. But, like one of them is, for example, appetite comes through eating, which can be both literal in terms of food, the more you eat, the more you're hungry, but also in terms of anything that we are savoring with the senses. So the more you are savoring with the senses, the more you want things, right? Instead, the more you let go, which is why she then talks about the safety of renunciation, the less you crave. The less you consume, the less you crave. And then we also have, another saying that says, money gives eyes to the blind. So once again, of course, the literal thing of like, we see a bunch of money and there's temptation arising in the mind, but also pretty much anything that like is enticing can create lots of different, our mind can produce lots of different, thoughts in regards to that object, and we want it more and more. So in a relationship, if we're not actually taking the precepts, and in particular here the precepts of essentially not doing sexual misconduct, which is essentially using our sexuality in a proper way, we see that we are harming others, obviously, but also essentially harming ourselves and cultivating, a lot of appetite for something that can never be satisfied. Essentially, we're hungry ghosts, with a really tiny mouth and a really huge stomach. So whenever we are cultivating essentially our desire, we are enlarging the stomach, but the mouth always stays the same, always so small. So we're constantly more and more and more hungry. And that hunger then creates those conditions to break even more precepts and be even more disregarding of the needs and care and well-being of the people that are around us. So Paravana sees it immediately. She sees the source. The problem is this untrained mind. The problem is falling again, becoming entangled with this thicket of the world of sensual pleasures that are enticing. But in reality, she sees them as foul smelling and painful. So she doesn't have the vipallasa anymore of, seeing the sukha in what is dukkha. And she also doesn't have the vipallasa anymore of seeing, the permanence in what is impermanent, in fact, or the beautiful in what is ugly, in the subha and what is asubha. And we see that actually her sister in the Dhamma Kema, and let me get her poem right here, has a similar sort of way of describing, well, not a similar way of describing, but actually in the same line, when we're talking about the non-beautiful. So here she is tempted by Mara, or rather, Mara tries to tempt her. And Mara appears as this really good-looking man. So he says, "You are young and beautiful. I am also a young lad. Come, Kema, let's have a good time with heavenly music." And Kema replies, "This putrid body, diseased and brittle, only brings trials and tribulations. I have a uprooted craving for sensual pleasures. Sensual pleasures are like the handle of an axe, and one's khandhas, the executioner's block. What you call appealing sensual pleasures are no longer appealing for me. In this way, all fixation is annihilated, the mass of darkness destroyed. Thus be aware, wicked one, death, you are destroyed." So we see that, that doesn't matter. Sometimes we get so fixated with the appearance of people, right? With the beauty of them, both in terms of physical beauty, but also in terms of the beauty of perhaps their charm, the beauty of flirting that there can be in a relationship, etc. And our maybe experience that we can have. We actually, there's another poem in the Therīgathā where I think it's Subha Jiva from Mango Grove, if I remember correctly, where actually similarly, it's not Mara, but it's a rogue, and he's trying to persuade the bhikkhuni to kind of run away with him and set up a family. He's like, even there in the forest, it's fine. We're going to just be here and enjoy sensual pleasures. And he starts describing how beautiful the forest is and this extremely romantic setup, while also creepily, kind of threatening that he might rape her in a sort of kind of nuanced way if she doesn't agree kind of spontaneously, then maybe she will agree forcefully or whatever. And so we see that maybe that is not necessarily always our experience, but we can see how those all of these kind of relationships can be such a thicket of so many different intentions. But we can also, our mind can get very enthralled with them. I mean, it's not a chance that there are so many like romantic comedies out there, right? Where there is a particular setup, a particular setting, and can be so romantic, as we say. So we can get actually very much mm, taken by we can be fooled by it, by all of these things. But we see that in this case, neither Kevan or Suba, Jiva from Mango Grove are fooled by it. And in particular, Kema talks about actually having a deep and profound understanding. And of course, since she's an enlightened being, she's fully understanding how this body looks beautiful, but in reality, it's not. Or better, it's not that it looks beautiful, the body per se, but rather we perceive it as beautiful. She's like, no, it's this, putrid, diseased and brittle. That's why we do a Suba meditation, to actually really see the unpleasant sides of the body, not to become Debbie Downers, but to rather have a full understanding of what we're talking about, and not be shocked when perhaps, at a certain point we're aging, or our parents age, or someone else around us ages and becomes decrepit. And then all sorts of, kind of unpleasant things happen in the body. We're like shocked. We're like, oh, how is this possible? It looks so great up until a few years ago, or even this morning. Look at this face, was so beautiful, but now instead it's like all open apart, and where it's all swollen and gross. Well, it was the nature of it since the very beginning, to be diseased. And so once we see that, we uproot craving for sensual pleasures. And that's not because we force ourselves not to want things, but because we fully understand how these things are. Hence, craving stops controlling us immediately. And in the Therīgathā, on this theme of beauty, actually, one of the famous ones is also the poem of Ambapali, who, on the other hand, she was very much intoxicated with youth. And so it was only later on that she's like, oh, okay, actually, now I'm reflecting on my body, now that I'm an awakened being, and, I'm like seeing all of these parts. I used to be so pretty, but now I'm essentially a wreck. And so she says, like how her eyebrows, for example, they were, let me read actually from the poem. Let's see. It's a very long poem, so I'll only like read a few of the things that she says. She's like, my eyebrows were such splendor, so well done, as if drawn by a painter. Because of old age, they are sagging and wrinkly. The truth speaker's words are never wrong. Of course, the truth speaker is the Buddha. And then she's like, the color of jasmine bud, my teeth were so splendid. Because of old age, they're broken and blackened. The truth speaker's words are never wrong. Where she's like, my arms were of such splendor, both similar to round crossbars. Because of old age, they're now like withered branches. The truth speaker's words are never wrong. And the poem ends. So this is all like she goes throughout all the sort of elements of the body. And then she's like, such was this body, now decrepit, an abode of much suffering, a house of decrepitude fallen into disrepair. The truth speaker's words are never wrong. So of course she's an enlightened being, and she sees the nature of how things are. But but yeah, it was no different. Essentially what she's saying is that now it's clear and apparent to everyone. But even when it was, in a sort of prettier state, we're only fooled by the body. We're only fooled by this sort of prettiness. It was always a house of decrepitude, fallen into disrepair. And so when we understand how things are, then also we can approach, other types of relationships, such as the mother and son relationship, such as the parent and child relationship that we kind of started with. We have also another example of in the Therīgathā of both Abhaya and Abhaya's mother talking, but also we have the flip side. We have lots of like Theris that are actually grieving because they lost their child. That is the sort of the most primordial types of grief, like how hard it is to lose someone that is our child. Can be, I've seen so many actually parents in my life who have been through so much suffering because they were still alive when they lost their child. In Italy especially, they went completely insane, even though they had perhaps other children that were still alive. But the pain can be so hard on someone because of that lack of understanding that is the nature of this body. That's the nature of the sentient being. So we see throughout the sutta, throughout the Therīgathā and throughout the suttas too, but in the Therīgathā in particular, obviously the story of Kisa Gotami, that is very famous, Ubiri, etc. But what I wanted to actually read was when the 500 elders, let me get it, 6.1, Therīgathā, the verses of the 500 elders, where they say, the Buddha says, gives them this teaching. You do not know how a being comes and goes, or whence that being came, yet you weep, O my child. If you really knew how a being comes and goes, you would not mourn, for you would understand that this is the nature of a sentient being. Unasked, they come. Without permission, they leave. Whence did they come? How long will they stay? Departing one place, one goes to another. One who has died in the form of a human being will be reborn again and again. As one comes, so one goes. So why lament, since that is so? And the 500 elders reply, at last you pulled out the thorn, difficult to see, stuck to my heart. I was writhing in grief after the loss of my child, but now that grief has been dispelled. Today the thorn has been pulled out. I'm free of craving, fully quenched. I go to the sage for refuge in the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. In this way, 500 Elder Bhikkhunis spoke. So this is their declaration of enlightenment of 500 women that were enlightened in that moment by the Buddha. And apparently they had all lost their children. But the Buddha gives them this teaching of understanding essentially, the nature of, I really love unasked, they come. Nobody asked them to come. And so in the same way, without permission, they leave. But that is the nature precisely of this body. It's the nature to grow old, to get sick, and then eventually to die. It's a natural, the opposite. So, we see how by doing these practices, we don't get depressed, but rather we start fully understanding the nature of reality. And then suffering is removed. So then instead of, cultivating all those anxieties or, attachments, and not in the psychological way, which is usually in psychology, the word attachment is my understanding that it's used in terms of caring about someone. But in Buddhism, we actually talk about it in terms of like something like that is attached, that is bound to you, like it's actually suffocating. And so it's always conditioned and kind of related to ourselves and to what we want and to what we like. And then we project it, we can have these like also relationships with our children, even when they are alive, that are very much, about what we want, about what we, care for them to do, rather than for their, own well-being. And so we don't allow them to live, and we also then don't allow them to die when they die if we see their death. So in this process, we're actually learning how to love without attachments, which is very difficult, of course, and it's very much a trial and error. But we have these fantastic examples, instructions from the Theris. So I'll read Abhaya's mother teaching to Abhaya, and she says, "Abhaya, this body is transient. This is what worldly beings should attend to. I will cast aside this body with mindfulness and clear comprehension. Amidst so much suffering, I devoted myself to heedfulness. I have obtained the destruction of craving and completed the teaching of the Buddha." And her daughter Abhaya says, "Mother, I contemplated the body from the soles of the feet all the way to the top of the head, seeing it as impure and fetid. Dwelling in this way, I uprooted all passion and extinguished all heat. I have become cool and quenched." So essentially, we have this beautiful example of mother and daughter, both bhikkhunis, both fully enlightened, and one, teaching really out of compassion for the welfare of her child, and her following the teachings of her mom, and really understanding the reality of things. And what a beautiful example of love without attachment that actually then has a really incredible happy ending. They live happily ever after, which is, nibbana. They lived happily ever after, cool and quenched. Instead of they were reborn over and over again, in countless eons of suffering. With the death there is birth, and with birth there is death. Buy one, get one free. And so then we can, of course, end with my favorite love story that is not mother and child, but is actually a relationship, and it's Baddha Kapilani and Mahakassapa. And I know that in this series of the Therīgathā, I read this poem over and over again, but it's never enough. So we can see Baddha Kapilani's declaration, and she starts by talking about first Mahakassapa. And so she describes him. "Kassapa, son and heir of the Buddha, has a well-collected mind. He knows his past lives, sees heaven and hell. He has reached the destruction of birth. He is an accomplished sage with perfect insight. He is a Brahmin who possesses the three knowledges." And then she says, "In the same way," I love the "in the same way," Baddha Kapilani possesses the three knowledges, has left behind death, and carries her last body, having conquered Mara and his army. Having seen the danger in the world, we both went forth. We have exhausted and tamed all the influences. We have become cool and quenched. This is like the best love story in the history of love stories, where they both, once again, as she says, see the danger in the world, and then look for the escape that the Buddha offers us, which is the safety of renunciation, letting everything go. And so they do what needs to be done, and they eventually attain full awakening. Isn't that incredible? Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. All right, so at this point, if you have any comments or questions, feel free to type them in. Good to see you, friends. Hello to Sui Mong Mong, Charlesley, Miguel, Matthias, Rajib, Vidura, John, Patricia, good to see you, Sarah, Juliana, Geeta, Sud, Fazim, Jay. Okay, so Faize says, physical body absolutely is unpleasant and hateful. Well, it's important that we don't get too extreme either. So the point of Asubha meditation is not to like hate the body and become disgusted by the body in the sense of like hating it, not wanting it, because that's basically developing another type of craving, which is the flip side of the same coin, essentially. Greed and hatred is not very different. It's just instead of wanting, we don't want something. So the objective has to be equanimity. The objective is to understand things as they are. Upekkha, as Bhante Sudaso says, is seeing closely. So when you see something closely, you fully understand it. Hence, it doesn't bother you anymore. But usually, we are so obsessed with the body, with the pleasant sides of the body, that we can't actually see it for what it is. So that's why we practice Asubha meditation, why we focus our mind on the unpleasant sides of it. And Jay says, yeah, the grief of someone is kind of selfish and filled with desire and attachment because we want them to still be with us. Yeah, there is that component. But of course, we shouldn't like feel bad about that. Grief is a perfectly natural feeling, and it will be we have a strong habit of being with people that we love and care about, hopefully, and then of course we create certain patterns around them, and since we're unenlightened, of course there is a lot of attachment as well, but there's also a lot of wholesomeness. So our practice is to understand, once again, with wisdom, what is wholesome and what is unwholesome, and in the end remove all the selfishness and keep all the compassion, harbor, like get all the compassion to flourish, but not to self-bash in the process, but rather to understand also with equanimity that that's once again the nature of how things are. That's why this practice is going against the stream, If it was going with the stream, then we wouldn't have any sort of problems, right? And Sud says, dear Ayya, if I understand this correctly, the escape is the Eightfold Path. So the Buddha talks about always reflecting on our experience. So he talks about the gratification, the danger, and the escape. And he says that the uninstructed worldling, sees the gratification in things. And then when he sees the danger, he tries to find an escape. And usually the escape is on another form of sensual pleasures, essentially. But the escape that the Buddha gives us is the escape of renunciation. So instead of looking for something else, we stop wanting, we go to the root of the problem. And so, yes, how do we do that? Is through the Eightfold Path. All right, and doesn't seem like there's any other questions or comments. So maybe that's all for this morning or evening, wherever you are. And we can end with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. May you all be well and happy, and may all good things come to you.